There we go.
Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to another series of Africa Forward. This sounded like a newsroom, but it isn't. It's a session that we hold monthly to enable the African chapters to come together, to collaborate, to share, to inspire. And today we have the right type of people that will talk about our topic today, which is shifting power to the communities. We're hearing people coming in, so it means there's a loud applause. And I hope it's not the World Cup that they're watching. So yesterday we had some Africans. We had Cameroon play and we had Ghana play, so that was quite exciting. So today we're here to talk about philanthropy and shifting power to the community. So we're not playing any World Cup games right now. We're here to talk real business and how it affects all of us. So I am very happy and excited to have a moderator today, Dr. Fred, who is the Africa Director of Ripple Effect. And he is apt and the right person because he is a seasoned professional and doctor association. He's from East Africa. He's joining us from Nairobi today. And he has over 25 years of experience in civil societies and empowering communities in Africa. So very exciting to have you today. And he will be sharing and moderating the session today with our key speakers. So I'll hand it over to you, Fred. Thank you so much for joining. We can kick off.
Thank you very much, Nwando. Thank you for the introduction and very special way.
I think you're muted, Fred.
Right, sorry. Can you hear me now? Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. Very much appreciated. And welcome to everyone to this session. This is part of monthly conversations on changing systems at all levels through collective action and bold new strategies. So please visit the website catalyst2030.net for more information. And note, Catalyst 2030 is actually a fast-growing global movement of people and organizations committed to achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. And this movement is about everyone. It's about communities, it's about government, it's about businesses, it's about organizations. And Africa Forward is actually an initiative of the Catalyst 2030 Africa chapter that seeks to rewrite the narrative about Africa through focusing on 5 critical pillars. So the strategic shift we want to see in, first of all, narrative shift. We want to see shift in ecosystem development, funding, job creation, career counseling, and also training and capacity development. In the 3rd week of every month, we engage key stakeholders in the community on key topics that will influence and move the Africa continent forward. And so please check the YouTube. There are many that have been done previously. You want to be able to view those ones. And today, it's really privileged to have very key experts on the topic that we are going to be discussing, which is philanthropy, shifting power to community. So I will have conversation. We have 4 experts on this, and I would like to start this first of all by introducing one of the experts, and this is called Mr. Andy Bryant. So Andy joined the Segal Family Foundation as executive director in 2010. He leads the foundation's team and implements the vision of the board of directors. He has overseen an increase in the foundation's annual giving from $2 million in 2010 to over $18 million in 2022. Alongside that, he's also seen the growth of partnership portfolio from 30 to now well over 300. So this makes the Segal Family Foundation the second largest US foundation in Africa, behind only Gates. The most important quantifiable changes that Andy has overseen include one, being able to increase Africa staff from 0 to 70%, Africa-led partners from 0 to 80% in 2022, and indeed having grants from 0 in 2010 to 100% in 2022. Andy has worked in international development for many years in Africa and in Asia, including positions with Tanzania Children's Fund and TechnoServe. He completed his BA from Princeton University in 2003 and subsequently graduated from Syracuse University in 2007. He has served as a Princeton Africa Fellow. He has also served on board of directors and leadership councils for Big Bang Philanthropy, Last Mile Health, Como Learning Centers, Princeton in Africa, and Spark Microplans. You'll agree with me that Andy brings some of the very, very important things we want to hear in this conversation. And so, Andy, very, very special welcome to you. Could I start, Andy, just by asking you, how really does philanthropy work, and what needs to change?
Thanks, Fred. I really appreciate that introduction. And hello to everyone out there. Thanks for joining the call on this Friday. For those of us in the US, we're the day after a big Thanksgiving holiday. Some of us are just waking up from a food coma. And for those of you, especially Africa side, thanks for joining late in the day when it might be time for
how's it going?
a glass of wine. Hey, if you're on the call and listening, try to mute yourself. Thank you. Yeah, Fred, the question is a good one and a broad one, how philanthropy works now. As a representative of a US born and I think African-led foundation, I'll speak on behalf of Western philanthropy. And as you mentioned, we're the second largest US grant maker in Sub-Saharan Africa behind Gates Foundation. So I think I'm well placed to speak on this vein. Let me start by saying, I'm certain there's those on the call who might argue there's no real appropriate place for outsiders like me or like Segal Foundation to be engaging in African development. That's a long conversation. I think one best had in person over coffee and beer. But I do disagree with that statement. I think that the tremendous resources, the billions of dollars that are being poured in, if it's channeled well, can be catalytic. But it really is a big if certain conditions are met. So that brings to your question, how philanthropy works now. I think we're transitioning eras in terms of how Western philanthropists think about funding proximate-led organizations. We're transitioning from the question of why Western funders like Segal Family Foundation should fund locally led orgs to a question of how. And I think that's a blessed and important transition. If we'd had this conversation 5 or even 10 years ago, I would have been trying to convince people like me, other Western philanthropies, that it was important, it was just, it was sustainable, it was impactful to fund locally led organizations. That question's been answered to a large degree. Most of my peers here in the US and the UK and in continental Europe down under agree that there's an important ethical motive to funding proximate led organizations. The question now becomes, how do they do so? And then you run into equally thorny, equally challenging resistance, which are some of these logistical barriers to resources moving from Western philanthropy to proximate-led organizations in Africa. And so I think that's where philanthropy is grappling with right now, is questions of how. How do we get money from A to B with a minimum of hassle, in a way that is useful and usable by the end user, the proximate-led organization, and in ways that the Western philanthropists can have some degree of peace of mind that their money is being used well. So I think that's where we're focused on our own donor engagement with other Western philanthropists, is trying to convince them of the various logistical routes that can happen with a minimum of pain on all sides. And that is cool, but it sort of changes the nature of the challenges. And I think that's something where it's a big challenge for the doers on this call, the social entrepreneurs, the proximate visionaries and leaders on this call, where rather than trying to convince potential supporters that they should fund you, trying to help them navigate the routes to do so. And that can be equally vexing. So I think that's something that we should maybe dig in later on in the call. But for now, I think that's where we're at, is this sort of transition from why to how.
Yes, yeah, no, thank you for that, Andy. I wonder, I mean, a lot of people even in this call are the ones who are managing, some of these, initiatives via the philanthropy, but they're also beneficiaries, communities on the ground. How can they be increasingly involved in some of these conversations? How do you interact with them? Because it's easy, for you, for instance, as the executive director, but how do we get that conversation going and get people more involved?
Yeah, good question, Fred. I think it's incumbent on all parties to figure out legitimate and well-working feedback mechanisms, both within their teams, vis-a-vis the communities they serve, and also with principal stakeholders like funders like ourselves. Our team on the ground across our 5 country offices in East and Southern Africa are regularly interacting with our grantee partners. I'm interacting with them, so there's a fairly good through line for information, good ideas, critiques, complaints to pass from New Jersey to Nairobi and back. I think it's a lot more challenging for Western philanthropists like ourselves that don't have teams on the ground, boots on the ground, day-to-day sort of fingers on the pulse of what's happening on the ground in East and in sub-Saharan African communities. For those folks, I think there has to be a lot more outreach on the part of the doers, the social entrepreneurs, which again is an increasing burden and hassle on the shoulders of the doers, but one that needs to be done to create those linkages really well.
Great. And just to the audience, please, if you have questions, put them in the chat. We will have some time for more discussion on this. But let me find out again from you, Andy, before I move to the next speaker. I think one of the things we are recognizing is that the solutions for the African problems actually rely on the Africans themselves to be able to provide that. And it is great to have support of foundations such as yours. But what are those collaborative and partnership initiatives between you and some of the organizations here and the social entrepreneurs, just to ensure that some of these solutions are not just discussed, but they can actually be taken forward and implemented by those that actually matter?
Okay. Well, I think one practical way for relatively small or relatively underattended, underfunded, underappreciated orgs to speak louder is by speaking collectively. Something we're really excited about is identifying and nurturing coalitions of local actors. For example, a large group of our Ugandan grantee partners has created something called the African Coalition for Social Impact. ACSI is a group of about 20 to 30 Ugandan-led organizations trying to figure out how they can speak with one mighty voice. When you start aggregating the collective impact of 20 or 30 organizations from for healthcare organizations, patient visits, for educators, pupils, number of kids under sponsorship or enrolled in schools, you start to see that the collective impact is quite large. And if you can figure out how to play nice with one another and speak with one uniform voice, vis-a-vis other funders like ourselves, that can start to be really powerful. So that's one particular route we're really excited about, is trying to identify legitimate, useful coalitions of local orgs so they can start speaking and working together.
Right. And how then do they get to you in a practical sense? So
yeah, great question.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. I am in the great position where I don't have to make difficult grant decisions any longer. We've placed that entirely in the hands of our local teams. As you mentioned in my initial intro, over the past decade, we've worked really hard to push all grant decision-making and purse strings, power over purse strings, to our program officers in Kigali, in Lilongwe, in Dar. So at this point, our best connection is through our POs on the ground in those capital cities.
Right. So the decisions can be made locally, no much influence, as long as these conversations are going on. That's what you're saying, Andy.
Yep, that's right. That's right. And then if there's other funders who don't have local teams on the ground, I think it's a lot more challenging. But one just practical tip I would say is utilize the friends you've got. So if Segal Family Foundation is already a grant supporter of yours, ask us to make those recommendations. For better or worse, Western funders will take the recommendations of other Western funders with such a large degree of credibility, again, whether it's earned or not. So utilize that, right? If you've got powerful friends, leverage that power.
Fantastic, fantastic. And by the way, in many cases, the priorities of this foundation and many funders, as a matter of fact, are not always matched to the needs of those in Africa, or the organizations, or even the communities. What is a level of influence that communities can also be able to have on how you do your own funding, rather than you probably saying, look, this is where we prioritize, irrespective of where the need is?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. That's a challenging one. You're coming in. I think this goes back to developing relationships of trust. It's something that funders all talk about all the time. We want to have trusted, close relationships with our grantee partners. It's such a naive thing for a funder like me to say, right? I consider trust to be a really simple equation. It's time spent together plus delivery on promises. So what that means is, if you're trying to influence a funder's giving agenda, their strategy, how they give money and to whom they give money, invariably that's going to derive from building a strong, trusting relationship with them, which is going to take time, right? So I think you need to figure out how you can engage. Ideally identify some overlap between your visions, and then build that relationship over time so you can be influencing them. We are heavily influenced by our longest standing and most trusted partners. We have a group of our partners we call our luminary circle, and they're just our OGs, right? Like our oldie but goodie partners we've been with for the longest time, and we regularly rely on them to help us set our agenda. But that did come with time and them delivering on promises and vice versa.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you. I think we'll come back to some of the discussions again. Allow me now to move to Ese. Ese, how are you doing? Fantastic. So Ese has served as a project director for Ese Trust Fund, which is a donor-advised fund managed by Trust Africa in Ogoni land in River State, Nigeria. She has spent the past 20 years working in international development field, supporting human rights defenders, organizations, developing non-profit boards, working with marginalized communities and groups, as well as youth-led organizations across the globe that advocate for youth inclusion in development projects, leadership, and youth empowerment. As a project lead for Ese Trust Fund, Ese has directed a multi-million US dollar fund for the benefit of Ogoni people in Niger Delta, Nigeria, instilling a new model of participatory community-based grant making for sustainable development. This is going to be very interesting for us to hear. In 2018, in her role as a project director for Trust Africa, she partnered with Africa Philanthropic Network, DFCF, and the Kenya Development Community Foundation to host a Twitter chat, which say, you say intermediary, I say what? You'll give us the answer to that, right? And she's also been able to write about her work in the philanthropic sector, and her recent article is What's the Matter with Small Grants. So very special welcome, Ese, to the discussions. And can I just start from where we probably started with Andy, your thoughts on where philanthropy is and what really needs to change?
Thank you so much, Fred. I want to say I'm no longer with the Ese Trust. I am now with the Global Fund for Community Foundations as the Global Network Weaver. And the fund is a different kind of partner or ally or friend. We convene, we network, and we bridge fund organizations, mostly working on the fringes of the ecosystem, of the philanthropic ecosystem. And the Global Fund believes that long-term change, what Andy was referring to, towards sort of this good society and the future that we want, really requires the collective action of individuals and institutions located wherever they happen to sit within the ecosystem, either from the edges or directly from the center, those with power, those without power, working at the grassroots, local, national, and international. That's just a little bit about how the Global Fund works. In trying to answer your question, I was thinking more really, maybe the question is, why isn't philanthropy more effective on the continent? After, 70 plus years and over $3 trillion of US dollars spent or given to Africa, African states, we still have the problem of poverty. We still have the problem of toxic, wicked problems that we're all trying to solve. And really, this is a legacy of uneven economic development. You have colonialism, you have political instability that has really turned the continent or has made the continent this favored destination of charitable investments from philanthropic organizations across the world. However, as I mentioned earlier, many of these investments have been driven by the voices and actions of people from the outside and not those who are actually closer to the problems that they're trying to solve. In Africa, there are really three broad ways that defines how money is donated or how money is given. You have, the high net worth individuals who make donations or start their own family foundations. You have a local organization that raises funds through grants, not usually through grants, but other sources as well. And then you have communities that pool resources together to tackle their challenges. All of these are local efforts, all aim to deal with local problems, of which there are plenty, and which makes it difficult for sometimes collaboration to happen. I think when we're talking about African philanthropy, there isn't really one definition that encompasses all of it. There are layers to this, and there are multiple narratives to defining African philanthropy. The issues of solidarity, self-care, sufficiency, resilience, these are tenets or concepts that are integral to how we define African philanthropy. I think what Andy was referring to earlier in terms of, looking for a cause and then trying to find resources to solve those problems is actually the opposite of how African philanthropy actually is practiced. There is the popular saying Ubuntu, which is, I am because you are, recognizing ourselves in others first before looking for a problem. For me, I think African philanthropy truly has the opportunity to provide agency to African people, creating trusted institutions that really allow for accountability. So this accountability and transparency, this is accountability to themselves, to each other, to other partners in the community, and not necessarily accountability to a donor or someone from the global north. I think, when we're thinking about community philanthropy, African philanthropy, these are communities that have assets, whether it's trust, people, knowledge, capacities. They are able to problem solve the challenges for themselves. They rely on relationships built over time, built over time. And really, it's a dynamic sort of localism in terms of how it functions. It needs to shift in the focus of power, embedding resilience throughout the entire process, flexibility around capacity, understanding, and end to transactional relationships, as Andy was referring to earlier. I want to talk a little bit about, you asked what needs to change. The Shift to Power movement, one of the sort of areas that I work in for the Global Fund, it seeks to reform the practice of development aid and institutional philanthropy. And it's a radical demand for something better for local people by engaging them as co-investors and co-owners in their own development. There are 4 parts of there are 9 points of the Shift to Power manifesto. The first 4 points really talks about things that we need to start doing. The next 4 points of the manifesto talks about things that we might want to expand on and to stop doing. And the last point talks about how in this movement to change and reimagining a different development aid, none of that means anything if we don't really start from within, with ourselves, and change ourselves in terms of what the change that we want to see. I can post later in the chat the manifesto, the Shift to Power manifesto for change. For those who might be interested, it's located on the Shift to Power Treehouse, a platform where we collect a lot of the narratives and stories around how people are using the manifesto or are using community-led, African-led philanthropy to really change the dynamics in terms of how they work. But I think, more important than that, we need to start thinking and talking about systems change. People and groups are already talking about changing the system, and there are many initiatives that now attempt to take a systems approach to many of the mess and the complexity within it. And so we need to recognize the different roles and actors and institutions that play a role in this ecosystem that we're trying to reimagine and build for a better future. I think I'll stop there. Maybe if you have more questions for me, I'm sure you.
Yes, no, thank you. Can I just follow up on what you've just talked about on Africa and philanthropy? You know as well as I do that there's still so much reliance on the West in terms of support to the programs within the continent. And as you rightly said, we continue to do very well, to do very badly in terms of challenges around poverty, alleviation, and all that. And we're in a continent of extremely rich individuals within a high number of very, very poor people. How can that be strengthened? The African philanthropy be strengthened to be able to serve the communities as well, but also in terms of just giving comfort to those who would be philanthropists, that some of the initiatives they would get involved in would actually make a real difference.
I think in these types of conversations or in the spaces that I've been in, what is most effective when talking about resource mobilization or working with philanthropists or high network individuals or even donors, we sometimes make the mistake of talking about money first, that as if that is going to be sort of the solution. And in many instances, it does matter. Money can make a big difference, especially around emergency type funds, working in social justice or human rights issues. Money helps alleviate many of the challenges that human rights activists are working in. But if you focus the conversation on money, then you miss out on many of the other tenets around community building that are actually stronger. So the relationships that are there, the capacity that are there, the knowledge that are there. I think sometimes we also make the mistake of looking for the perfect we want the perfect type of organization that looks a certain way, that acts a certain way, that has the right type of staff, right pedigree, to walk into the door, to speak the INGO lingo. And if you're looking for that type, you also fall into the habit or maybe the mistake of doing development a specific way that hasn't really been empowering to community actors. So I think, in terms of access, in terms of finding those who are working with donors or funders, especially from the global north, there needs to be a new skill of patience, practicing solidarity, practicing truly listening and working with them, not looking for the perfect, really looking for how do people problem solve. And we saw this after COVID or during COVID, when many of the INGOs and donors left many African states in droves, the money left. It was community organizations, community actors who were the first responders, who went to their neighbors, who went out into the community to look after each other. And in many cases, raising funds equal to, and in sometimes more than the INGO donor or the money that was leaving the countries in droves. So it isn't about do we not have the money? There is, COVID has proven that there is money on the ground. We just have to be creative and innovative in who we speak to and how we actually raise those resources. People do give, Africans do give, and they do support institutions and organizations that see that they're doing the good work. But I think we should be careful about not starting the conversation talking about money. That forces certain kind of behavior that really does not bring about dignity.
Exactly. Yeah, recognizing that there are other resources that we can be talking about. It's not just about money. But just the last question before I move on. Andy mentioned about consortium, coalitions, and all that. And from your experience, how could we strengthen collaboration within Africa to give a proper and better voice in negotiating, with donors, so that whatever then they support in terms of system change is really what is appropriate for the continent?
Yeah, there are African philanthropic institutions or infrastructure philanthropic institutions. The African Philanthropic Network is one, African Philanthropy Forum is another, the East African Philanthropy Network is yet another. I'm aware of a new sort of initiative and coalition that is spearheaded by WINS and Trust Africa in West Africa to really build up the West African philanthropic ecosystem. So these infrastructure institutions, philanthropic institutions do exist, and they are there to provide resources, to provide capacity, to provide training. WACSI is another one based out of Ghana that does a lot of trainings and capacity involvement around strategic planning, board development, capacity, resource mobilization, working with donors. So that these institutions exist, and I think maybe more effort needs to be made around their services or their resources. Before this webinar is over, I can make sure to put in the chat links to their website and some of their platforms where folks can go to.
Thank you so much, Ese. And so allow me to bring our third speaker to the conversation. I hope she's connected. Ifeyinwa Ugochukwu, is she there now, Nwanda?
Yes,
I'm here.
Oh, fantastic. Yes, special welcome. And Ifeyinwa is the CEO for Tony Elumelu Foundation, the Africa's leading philanthropy, empowering thousands of young African entrepreneurs from basically all the countries within the continent. Prior to her appointment as the CEO of the foundation, she held the position of Director of Partnerships and Evaluation at the same foundation, where she applied her passion for advocacy to introduce a sustainable model of scaling the impact of the foundation's $100 million entrepreneurship program by forging some very great strategic alliances with both public and private stakeholders in the global development ecosystem. She provides overall leadership and direction to her multi-talented team in executing the foundation's mission, which is rooted in Afro-capitalism. You'll talk to us about that, and positions the private sector as a key driver of economic and social wealth creation in Africa. Ifeyinwa is passionate about entrepreneurship and innovation, and is a firm advocate of the principle that the empowerment of African entrepreneurs is a solution to tackling Africa's key challenges. That employment and poverty. She's a barrister and solicitor for the Supreme Court of Nigeria, holds a bachelor's of law degree from the University of Wales. She's also an associate of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators and holds a postgraduate degree in business and executive coaching from the Integral Africa Institute, Cape Town in South Africa. She also serves as co-chair of the steering committee at UNICEF Generation Unlimited, and also chairs UN World Food Programme Zero Hunger Roundtable Sustainable Committee. So now you have all the solutions for us, right? Very special welcome. So really tell us, how is this working for you in terms of philanthropy? How does it work? And what do we really need to do to be able to get to where we should be in terms of alleviating the problems that bedevil us?
Thank you so much, Fred, for the warm welcome and long introduction. It's an absolute delight to be here as part of this monthly discourse that focuses on changing the narrative in Africa. It's something that we all understand very clearly, and we all are doing in order to build a model for sustainable development across multiple ecosystems. I think that when it comes to philanthropy, incidentally, this is one word that we hardly use at the Elumelu Foundation, even though we are a philanthropy, but it's not typically how we describe ourselves, and I think this is a classic example of the new face of philanthropy. When you think about the fact that the dictionary meaning of philanthropy is the desire to promote the welfare of others, expressed especially by the generous donation of money to good causes, it gives insight as to why organizations like ourselves would not typically describe ourselves as philanthropy, because whilst donation of money is a huge part of what we do in terms of effort, it actually takes the least amount of work. We are intensely private sector driven, result oriented, and execution focused. And philanthropy today is no longer about passively giving money to a good cause, like the previous speaker just said, but it's about rolling up one's sleeves and getting into the trenches and with the recipients or the beneficiaries to ensure maximum impact. And that is why the topic that was chosen for today is very apt indeed, because it is truly about shifting the power to communities, to the ecosystems. And this ecosystem is made up of public sector stakeholders, it's made up of private sector players, and of course, the beneficiaries themselves. And so the myth about philanthropy, that is the only way to make an impact is by donating money, could not be further from the truth, as we heard from all the previous speakers. Over the past few decades, philanthropy has developed significantly and now includes a wide range of activities that go way beyond monetary donations. The traditional method of giving money, of providing money alone, is being replaced by philanthropists, NGOs, and charities who now devote more of their time and talent to providing strategic advice, training, market linkages, mentoring, upskilling, capacity building, and of course, funding to the beneficiaries, all for maximum impact. And so the emphasis today for philanthropy is on high impact, scalable, and sustainable outcomes. This is why supporting and accelerating the growth of the African entrepreneurship ecosystem for us, because entrepreneurship is our focus, that is the future of entrepreneurship. And that, by extension, is the future of philanthropy. Because we know that as far as Africa is concerned, the SMEs are the foot soldiers on the ground. They are the community that we need to empower. Because once you empower the entrepreneurs, they solve all of Africa's problems. And it is in all of our best interests to solve Africa's problems, because a prosperous Africa means a prosperous world. Just to give a bit of insight into what we do, as you know, the Tony Elumelu Foundation, we've been championing entrepreneurship empowerment as the surest route to sustainable economic development on the continent since 2010. Our founder in 2015 launched a $100 million commitment to train and fund 10,000 African entrepreneurs. To date, we've trained and funded, we've trained over 400,000 and funded just under 16,000. And, you know, for us, once our entrepreneurs succeed, we succeed. That is our bottom line. A recent PwC study on our beneficiaries showed that those 15,000 plus entrepreneurs have gone on over the last 7 years to create 400,000 direct and indirect jobs. This is proof of concept. So the work that we're doing through training, through mentoring, to funding, you know, connecting them to networks and market linkages is now having a snowball effect on their communities, creating jobs and generating additional revenue. So there is no larger community on the continent of Africa than Africa's youth. And I think that as philanthropies, that should be the communities that we focus on in terms of reaping the democratic dividend of the work that philanthropies and NGOs are doing across the continent. We all know that Africa is the only continent on the globe getting younger. By 2050, reports show that 1 in 4 people on Earth will be African. In fact, a recent World Economic Forum report shows that by 2030, Africa, the world's global youth will be 42% African. This simply means that every year we need about 12 million jobs on the continent, but we're at the moment only producing 3.1 million jobs. And so for our work as a community of philanthropies and NGOs, working with governments, working with development organizations, we need to be asking ourselves, how can the work that we do create jobs on the continent, which will ensure that Africa's burgeoning youth population, which some are even saying is a ticking time bomb, it'll ensure that it is the world's greatest opportunity as opposed to the world's greatest catastrophe. When you think about the fact that IMF recently said that by 2035, there'll be more young Africans entering the workforce each year than the rest of the world combined, you see that the work that we have to do is monumental. But together, we can get it done. There's a popular African proverb that says, if you don't bring up the children properly and set them on the right path, when they grow up, they'll burn the village down. And so that's why as philanthropies, the most important work that we're doing should be that which will impact the youth of Africa. So I think that for us as an organization, we know that entrepreneurship empowerment is what will change Africa's narrative. And Africa is so ripe for a new narrative. Our youth are at the center of this narrative. Gone are the days of handouts and aid. The new face of philanthropy is about sustainability and empowerment. And we need to collectively usher in an era of fair play, justice, and equity across the globe through community-centered philanthropy. A wise woman once said, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. It's all about community. It's all about partnerships. I'll leave it there.
And that is actually an African proverb as well. So that's really beautiful. But before I let you go, one of the things that crossed my mind is as the foundation, in a very practical terms, how can, and most of the people on this call are probably leaders who are trying to also get solutions, to their own target groups. How can they get in touch with your foundation? How can they access it? What is the process like? What do they need to do to be able to benefit from it?
So for entrepreneurs across Africa, so we run one of the largest private sector-led entrepreneurship programs because it's Pan-African, it's across all 54 African countries, and it's open to any entrepreneur who is African and whose business is in Africa. They do not have to be physically present in Africa themselves, but the businesses must be in Africa. And our portals open January 1st every year, so it's round the corner. January 1st every year on tefconnect.com. That's our online digital platform. And every year we open our portal to hundreds of thousands of entrepreneurs across the African continent to come and apply. And what is really unique about the work we do is that we do not ask that you have already started your business, even if it's just an idea in your head. What we're looking for is entrepreneurs and young Africans who can show that they have leadership qualities, we can show that their ideas have market opportunity, it's scalable, it's feasible. And once you can show that, you have an opportunity to join our alumni network. You have the opportunity to receive our proprietary training program that has been likened to a mini MBA, to receive mentoring. And of course, if you scale through, to receive seed capital funding of $5,000. So typically that is how we work. It's a yearly cycle, starts January 1st and the portal closes March 31st every year.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. Now, I want to open this up to any questions from the audience. So if anyone has a question, please just raise your hand and we'll be able to do that, get the speakers to respond. But can I start maybe going back to Andy and Ese? With all these efforts, incidentally, the extreme poverty has still increased in the continent. Yet so much resources have actually been put to changing that. What are we doing wrong, or what can we do differently to change that? And I know, Ife, you mentioned about scalable and sustainable impact. Some of these are very good, but on a practical terms, we are getting more people getting poorer, the youth bulge, Africa being the youngest continent. What can we do differently? Andy, and we can go to Ese as well.
Well, I think a lot of the purpose of this, the thrust of this panel is going to be the biggest solution, right? I think you can pour in billions of dollars and $1 is not equal to the next dollar, right? Billions of dollars coming with heavy restrictions, top-down imposition of an agenda that was rooted or authored in Brussels or DC is going to be worth, I don't know, what's the discount rate on that? 90% less than a dollar that is sent freely with multi-year general operating support. And in fact, like a lot of those SMEs that Ifeyinwa mentioned, that her foundation is supporting, they're going to grow slowly but slowly and then really take off in a matter of years, if not a decade or more, right? Like there's some tail to this. At least on the Western philanthropy side, we're only now waking up and rooted in the social justice movements of the last few years in terms of understanding and appreciating the value, the justice, the impact, and the sustainability of investing in proximate-led organizations. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, that realization's a first step. The second step is figuring out the how to send resources in an appropriate and just way. And that's what we're sort of agonizing with as a sector, as a collective. So it's going to take time. Unfortunately, that's not a very helpful answer. We want a quick solution. I'm American. I want a really quick solution, but it doesn't always work out that easily.
Yes. Yeah, you're right. Ese, your thoughts?
Hi, Fred.
I think she dropped off.
No, I'm still here. I did drop off a little. I came back. So I missed your question, Fred. I think you were starting to ask when my network went down, but I'm back.
Yes. No, I was asking generally. We seem to be putting in more efforts to change the continent, but we, as a continent, are probably in a worse situation. The extreme poverty has increased in many countries. What could we do better? What could we do differently to really change the way things are done, but more particularly have much more sustainable and scalable, impact, as was mentioned earlier?
Yeah, I think there's an urgency of now. Yes, the problems are much more. COVID has made it worse. I think according to the World Economic Forum, the impact or the effects of COVID means that we've essentially lost a decade in terms of development work on the continent. So not only do we now have to play catch up, but we also need to also simultaneously try to eradicate, if we can, many of these toxic problems. There isn't, I think I'll probably follow Andy's model. There isn't a quick solution or a quick fix to this. Part of it still remains, what needs to still be done is around really understanding and supporting community organizations on the ground to do the work better. So maybe this is more visibility. Maybe this is more communication and changing the narrative. Maybe some of this is also about money, but ultimately, I think, you know, it's not, the problems that we have, it would cost billions, maybe trillions to try to resolve. But there really isn't a quick fix. I think if you are in the business of truly shifting power, of truly community-led work, then you have to be in it for the long run. And you have to practice patience. You have to practice trust. And trust is not something that can be projectized. You know, it is going to take time to get to know people, get to know the organizations, get to know what their successes are, get to know what they're struggling with. And this can sometimes take 5-7 years before you finally find an initiative or even a project that you can now collaborate together, co-create together to now solve a particular problem. So I think my biggest thing is to take time and to invest in trust building or relationship building aspect.
Okay. And I see there's a question there that is asking what can private foundations do to help, you know, unlock overseas development? Is that ODA to help to unlock the funding from private foundations and all that, because that's really gone down in many cases. Andy, what can private foundations do to help unlock that?
Well, I think we've had the greatest success engaging with USAID, GIZ, JICA, and the rest of the acronyms in the country offices in Nairobi and Dar and so forth, right? We've had much less success engaging with the folks in DC. This year has been a year of big hot air conversations in which the USAID administrator, you know, said that she was, in the latest big promise, said that USAID would devote 25% of its billions of dollars in ODA every year towards locally led organizations, which made for a great headline. But then we started getting into the details, and it becomes much more difficult to navigate a system that's so built on inertia and entrenched actors. So that said, where we've been most successful is engaging in country offices, figuring out where pockets of resources that are a little bit less restricted, a little bit more experimental in nature can be tapped into or influenced. I think a big challenge is you meet an awesome GIZ country officer, and then they're moved to Zimbabwe or Tunisia or Malaysia the next year, and so there's turnover at such a fast clip. But that said, you know, I think funders can try to support organizations with capacity input, put us in a position where they can build out really strong monitoring, evaluation, learning systems so that they have the rigorous evidence base to be able to most cleanly transition into ex-lateral support eventually. Yeah, it's the best I got.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And Ese, from just your experience, it's very easy for us to talk about having people at the center, and it's become a jargon. You know, how do we exactly make that happen? You know, many organizations go around and say people are the center of what we do, but are they indeed? And how do we make that happen? Because we know even governments in Africa will say they are working for their people, but are they really doing that? You know, how do we change that?
It's a really great question, Fred. I think one simple way is to ask who gets to make the decisions. If you have the same people making the same decisions, those usually with the purse strings, the power, the money, then people are not at the center. So I'll give an example. In my last job working for the Kisi Trust Fund with Trust Africa, we intentionally use participatory grant making as the model for how we will give out funds. And one way we did this was going out into the marketplace, asking the market woman, the woman that's never been in a boardroom, that's never talked to a donor before, that probably does not understand that there is such a thing as a philanthropic development ecosystem. Our world is very much smaller than the world that we work in. And asking her opinion and asking her to give a presentation in front of the board. When you empower those who are not used to being asked their opinion, who are not used to making decisions in such a public space or in such a powerful room, that's when you involve people. That's when people become at the center. And like I mentioned earlier, the mistake sometimes we do when we're thinking about working with people is that we are looking for perfection. We are looking for things that look like what we want to fund. And sometimes you have to look beyond that and really just listen, really connect with people on a human basis. You know, people are the ones that are making the decisions. Are young people part of your leadership board? Are people with disability part of your leadership board? Are people who have been affected by floods and famine part of that board, or that committee or decision-making group? How do you ensure that you really, when you are sitting at that table, you ask yourself, who else is in here? And maybe sometimes it's about creating a different kind of table that allows for other people to be part of that room. I mean, there are some conversations that have talked about, do we even need boards? Are boards necessary? Because sometimes they can be the barrier to actually getting funds across. So maybe scrapping boards altogether and just going straight out into a town hall meeting in the community and saying, look, we have an idea. We don't know if this idea is great, but you tell us what you think, how will you solve this problem if you were in my shoes? And people will answer. People will say, you know, we've tried this before. This happened before. It didn't work, but we learned one or two things. So being humble also in that process allows you to truly center people at your work.
Thank you. Thank you. But I like, you know, setting a different kind of table. Fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, we are running out of time. Thank you very much. Any last remarks before I hand over back to Nwando? Andy, your last remarks, please. This has been fantastic.
Thanks, Fred. Really appreciate your moderation throughout and Ese and Ifeyinwa's wise remarks. No, I just want to offer encouragement. I think most of these people on this call are social entrepreneurs, the doers who are out here really scraping by to find some resources, some sunlight to keep moving. Not knowing a ton about what you do on a day-to-day basis, I imagine it's driven by inspiration and real deep passion for the communities you serve. And I want to applaud you for that. Keep it up if you can, and I hope you find legitimate and real avenues to find people to appreciate your work and ultimately fund it. So keep it up.
Thank you. Thank you, Andy. Any final remarks?
I think this type of work, the conversations that we're having in this forum and in others that I've been part of, I think we are now at this point in terms of really asking ourselves the how, the question that Andy brought about earlier. How do we actually make change? How do we actually have impact? In addition to asking the how, we're also asking ourselves the hard questions. And it's not to romanticize the work that local communities are doing in the global south, there are challenges, there are problems. We don't sometimes trust each other, but to still stay in this game, to still stay in this movement building, this exercise of reimagining a different world. Organizations like the Global Fund are there to really work with those at the fringes where people don't often talk to them. The spotlight is not usually on them. They are doing the hard work of community-led work. They're doing the hard work of shifting power. They may not always call it those things. They may not call it shift the power. They just know that they have access to a different way of accountability and transparency and power distribution. And those types of organizations are the organizations we support, that we work with, that we try to leverage their impact. So I would say continue the good work. And if there are resources, materials that people need in terms of advancing or changing the narrative of how they work, we can definitely always help in providing access to and sharing some of these resources.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ese. And I love, when I listen to the discussions, it's very much aligned even to what we are doing as an organization, which is about to inspire and equip African communities to transform lives and protect the planet. And that is ripple effect. And it's a privilege to be working with Catalyst 2030. There is a website that is provided. And Nwando, I suspect you will give us more information. Thank you very, very much to everyone. I think we've run out of time. Back to you,
Thank
Nwando.
you so much, Fred, Dr. Fred, and all the panelists that we had today. Africa Forward, again, is an initiative of Catalyst 2030, and it is to change the narrative, talk about the ecosystem, funding, job creation. And we're so excited to host this month's session. So follow our channels, and we'll be in touch for next session. Thank you again, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you, everybody.